afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I'm Matt Ross, Editorial Director of the publishing house Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants around the world. Today, though, we're focusing on the UK, discussing the government's desire to level up areas outside London and the South East. Last June, we ran a four-part webinar on various aspects of the Levelling Up agenda, and on this budget day, we're revisiting the aspect of this topic with the greatest impact on departments' daily operations. Its goal of moving 22,000 civil servants out of London by 2030. We've seen today the announcement of Treasury's move of 750 civil servants to Darlington. There is a £4.8 billion levelling up fund that may help to generate some of the infrastructure and workspaces required too. The government has various goals around this agenda. It wants to bring skilled jobs and investment into the areas that need them, to reduce office costs, to get policymakers and senior leaders out of the Whitehall and Westminster bubble, and less overtly to shore up support for newly elected Tory MPs in Labour's former heartlands. But we've seen similar initiatives before with mixed results. I remember covering the 2003 Lions Review back in my days working on urban regeneration. So senior leaders worry about bringing staff with them as they move out of the capital, about recruiting the right skills in their new locations, and about maintaining their contact with ministers and their connections across Whitehall. Partly as a result of that, we've ended up with a lot of support functions and transaction processing operations across the country, but far fewer policy-making staff or senior leaders. And some of the agencies that moved out wholesale did lose skills and influence over a period. The pandemic and the shift to remote working may change those calculations. Civil servants don't want to go back to the office full-time. Many ministers and senior leaders have understood the advantages and built the habits of remote working, and organisations have adapted their working practices to fit the needs of a more dispersed home working staff. So while COVID has created huge social and economic costs in the North Midlands, of course, the economic and social changes it's fostering might enable more skilled professionals to live there, enjoying lower living costs, better quality of life, while enjoying the kind of careers that it's harder to have currently outside London and the South East. We'll begin with short presentations from our four panellists. We aim to save about 45 minutes for questions, both from myself and from you, the audience. So it's your chance to have your questions all answered directly by the panellists there. As questions occur to you, you just click on the Q&A window button at the foot of the screen, type in your question, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. Do please add a note there if you don't want me to use your name as I put the question. So just to introduce the panel, as we can see, Stephen Boyd is Chief Exec Officer of Government Property Agency in the Cabinet Office, which works to improve civil services property management and reshape its workspaces. Philip Rycroft, former DEXU Permsec, prior to that head of the UK Governance Group, which oversees the UK government's relationships with the devolved administrations. He's also spent many years working for the Scottish Government, so a rare Whitehall insider who spent much of his career looking outside London. Jenny Ryden is a partner at our knowledge partner Montague Evans, a property consultancy. She focuses on strategic property advice and works closely with Government Property Agency and others in civil service. And Angela Barnacle, Chief Officer for Asset Management and Regeneration at Leeds City Council, so an expert in physical redevelopment and local economic growth, based in the home of a big cluster of civil service bodies and one of the government's new hubs. So we'll hear briefly from each of the panellists and then come back to questions. If we could start with Stephen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Stephen Boyd. I'll speak for about 5 minutes. I'll say a little bit about the GPA to start with, then talk about relocations from London, spend the majority of the time I'm speaking talking about impact on the regions and how that is expected to feel for the civil service, and then finish off by talking about how we think that supports our people. So starting with the GPA, so as Matt says, we're about managing the government's office and warehouse property as a strategic asset. And one of the things we do there is deliver some of the large programs that will help to do that, such as the Government Hubs program, delivering large offices across the UK, but also thinking about how we consolidate the Whitehall campus that's left behind and make sure we do that in a sustainable way. And that's delivering a small contribution towards the government's levelling up agenda. And in that, we work closely with the Cabinet Office's Places for Growth team. So what do we mean by relocations from London? Well, as Matt says, that's a target of 22,000 people by 2030. And that will leave a much smaller Whitehall campus with around about 45,000 civil servants left working in central London. And we're gradually closing offices in central London to achieve that. But it also means the relocation of people or the relocation of roles. This is something that's happening over time to the regions, and aiming to do that in a way that brings functions together in what's known as clusters, where you might have people working from multiple departments in similar roles in a similar part of the UK. So how might that impact on regions? Well, on taking on the property from departments, we're taking on quite a fragmented property estate, and we're working to rationalise and consolidate that. And that's going on gradually everywhere in any event. Where roles have been relocated from London, that adds to the requirement in that location. So we feed that in on top of the existing people in that location. So when talking about moving people out of London or moving roles out of London, we shouldn't forget that there are already a lot of civil servants already around the nations of the UK. It may be that some of those are in more junior grades. And so one of the key things as part of this work is to make sure that policy-making staff and senior civil servants move as part of that to try and achieve some kind of cognitive diversity. So people who think and work in a different way to make sure that the policies devised for the UK are the ones that support everyone. Now, we'll be doing that by creating hubs in some places, that's larger offices which come with amenities such as conference facilities and cafes and business event centres and that kind of thing, but also some smaller offices. And we've heard recently about Wolverhampton, where MHCLG are going to base some of their people, and also today, not necessarily that small an office, quite a large one for the Treasury and supporting departments in Darlington, and that will create a network of UK government offices across the UK. Of course, that network's there already, but making sure that it is managed and delivered in a strategic way. And that includes working with local authorities, and sometimes that might be shared facilities, but it will always be working to think together about the skills agenda, the green agenda, how we support city centres, which have had a very hard time recently, and how we can look together to support things like good public realm. And so what might that mean finally for our people? Well, many civil servants have been at work on the front line, of course, over the last year, but a large proportion have been at home. And during that time, we've taken the opportunity to survey a very large number of those people and gathered information from 26,000 people who've been working at home over that period. And we've got a good view on the sort of working environment they would like and expect post-COVID. And we're definitely taking this opportunity to move much more towards a hybrid working approach, with people working some of the time in the office and some of the time at home. And that will probably depend hugely with the type of roles those people are carrying out. To support that, we need to make sure that it's not just the workplaces that are being designed properly for people, which is a large part of the Government Property Agency's job, but also that comes alongside the right technology and helping departments with understanding the behaviours and leadership that are required to make the most from that new arrangement. And that's something that we're taking forward across government as part of the Smarter Working programme. We know that offices are going to be different, and it's a little bit of a crystal ball at the moment, but we do know those offices will need to better support collaboration, creativity, community, and caring, because much of the individual type work can be done quite effectively at home. So next steps, we've got a good set of funding arrangements out of the spending review that was carried out earlier in the year. We're getting increasingly clear view on what departments need and where they hope to be relocating their roles. And we'll work together with them and our partners, including Montague Evans, who we'll hear from later on, about delivering value for money solutions in the regions. I hope that's will do from me, Matt. I'll leave you to the next panelist.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yes, and Philip.
Right, thanks, Matt. Very interesting, Stephen. I through a sort of 30-year career, a bit like Matt was implying at the start of this, sort of bounced in and out of this as a policy area, getting jobs, in my case, out of Edinburgh, as well as out of London, and thinking about the broader benefits of that. I think the really key point that Stephen made in his presentation was around the nature of the jobs that, in my view, need to move out of London. Of course, the vast majority of the civil service already works outside of London. The 70, 80,000 that are in London or its environs include, however, the majority of the senior civil service. I think it is about 70%. Stephen, correct me if that number's wrong. That number proportionately goes up even higher if you take out of that total those civil servants who are still within the GB civil service, based in Edinburgh and Cardiff. So it's those jobs, the senior civil service and the policy making jobs, which have been most sticky. And those are the ones I think that need to be got out of London. Now, there's a good sort of economic development reason for that. These are good jobs, they're well-paid jobs for the most part. And the sort of people these jobs will attract, I think, will have a positive spillover effect into local labour markets. This is skills and experience that can over time benefit both the wider public sector in different localities, but also the private sector. But I think the upsides of this sort of relocation go a lot further than just those local economic benefits. Whitehall, I would contend, others may disagree, but let's have the debate, is by instinct to centralising bureaucracy. Relatively few senior civil servants have experience of different tiers of government. Some have, but not very many. And most civil servants, and the policy profession in particular, will spend most of their career working in London. So wherever they've come from originally, they move to London, start their career, and they'll tend to stay there. And in my view, that has an inevitable effect of rather narrowing perspectives. And I speak with some experience of this for 7 years, responsible for trying to get Whitehall to understand devolution, despite the fact we'd had devolution, this is to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland for 20 odd years. That was an uphill battle. And it was partly because there was very limited experience in Whitehall of those different tiers of government, or of what life was like in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Now, moving folk out of London won't necessarily solve a narrowness of outlook all on its own, but it will help. In my own experience, I worked more or less for 10 years in Whitehall. During that time, I continued to live in Scotland. So even though I'm spending most work weekdays in London, at least at the weekends, and sometimes if I could work in the Edinburgh office I was responsible for, I was rubbing shoulders with people who were steeped in Scottish politics, in Scottish opinion, and I could take that back to the debates in Whitehall. It may not have improved me as a civil servant, but it did keep me grounded. And I am sure there would be a similar benefit to getting other policy profession civil servants, senior civil servants out, not just into the Midlands and the north of England, but also into Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And it's just worth also reflecting on the fact that this does increase the pool of available talent. It may surprise some folk who think London is the centre of the universe, but some people either can't for family reasons or don't want to live in London. having more of these good jobs outside of London makes that pool of talent available to the civil service. Now, I don't underestimate the challenges of all of this. Some of them have been alluded to already. Just a few quick thoughts on that, which we can discuss. The proposition has to be an attractive one. By definition, we've seen some previous relocations that have struggled a bit. The ONS going to Newport took a while for that to settle down. A Scottish example, when Scottish Natural Heritage moved out to Edinburgh to Inverness, it took some time for those relocations to settle down. So the proposition has to be attractive. The civil service and ministers ultimately need to accept there is a cost to this. There is an increase in travel costs because people will still have to go down to London for various things. I got the thick end of this. My travel costs were paid for from Scotland to London, and I ended up in the Sunday Times for my sins for that. But I thought it was a price worth paying, having at least one permanent secretary at a time when there was an existential threat to the United Kingdom, who sort of knew where Scotland was. But the price of that was my travel tickets were paid for, not first class, by the way. It also needs critical mass for this to work. And I do worry slightly, frankly, about the Wolverhampton Darlington decisions, because this looks like putting individual packets of civil servants in different towns. I think you do need to focus on particular regional centres and build up that critical mass to get enough senior jobs for there to be a career structure for people who might want to locate in those areas. But above all this, it does require a mindset shift in Whitehall. My experience as somebody who had offices when I worked in Whitehall, had teams in Cardiff and Edinburgh, tried to work certainly from Edinburgh because that was near home, some days during the week. It was really difficult at times to be able to dial into, as we were doing in the day, meetings, particularly in the Cabinet Office. The tech was pretty rubbish, but the attitude was also pretty rubbish. If you weren't in the room, you weren't really there. Now, the pandemic would have changed the tech because everybody's doing this sort of stuff now, but the mindset has to shift with it. But with those conditions met, I think this could be really powerful for the civil service. And more importantly, ultimately, it will make for better policy making, which in turn supports the levelling up agenda.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. Thank you. So we'll go straight on to Jenny Ryden of Montague Evans.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Matt kindly introduced, I'm Jenny Ryden from Montague Evans, and I'm a strategic property consultant. And what that means is I help our public sector clients solve organisational, economical, indeed social issues where property is at the heart. But today, I really wanted to focus on the role of private sector in supporting and driving the levelling up agenda and indeed hopefully making a success of it. The case for change for levelling up is well known, but the process to getting us there, I believe, shouldn't solely be seen as a central local government problem to solve. So I wanted to cover 3 points where I think private sector can be leveraged to enable sustainable levelling up. Firstly, around space. And Stephen's touched on some of these points about creating great commercially viable, fit for purpose spaces for people to work from, present opportunities presented by post-COVID recovery as well, creating lots of those excellent spaces to drive forward. Secondly, around maximising local to support this national objective and enabling a quality of life and thriving community in any city or town. And finally, as my other panelists have also touched on, recognising levelling up is not just about organisations and businesses, it's actually about people and creating clusters of talent and the ability to access these key skills in different ways. So firstly, on space to support relocations, now more than ever, there are opportunities for private sector and the property industry to be a catalyst to drive forward this agenda through investment in developments, accessing funding, reimagining spaces and regenerating urban areas. the changing type of space we need post-COVID, again, as Stephen's alluded to through the civil servant survey, is becoming well rehearsed and evidenced. Teams want more flexibility and agility in their working week, but equally important is a space and a base to connect and collaborate with colleagues. So what solutions are we looking at here for that type of environment? Well, an easy solution to moving FTEs quickly across the UK would be to lease the existing office space in these cities that have been identified. There's some on the market, and away we go. You know, we could actually answer these relocation problems quite quickly, but that wouldn't necessarily be the most sustainable answer. I think the challenge to drive a more beneficial solution is to strategically assess all of those surplus assets in a location, identify opportunities to repurpose vacant space and spot areas that are primed for regeneration. A couple of examples: we're working with local authorities outside London who are looking to do just that, and taking a vacant retail store for a Debenhams that's recently left the high street and looking to repurpose that into an office hub and collaboration workspace, bringing people back to the high streets, creating jobs and breathing life back into our towns and city centres. In addition, I think government are extremely well placed and positioned to maximise this potential and orchestrate the private sector to work hard to find the best, most commercially viable and socially beneficial outcome by leveraging their covenant strength and buying power post-COVID. But recognising it's not all just about the office and the desk. As we know, the spaces between the buildings that we work can be equally important as the buildings themselves, which leads me on to my second point. Sustainable, long-lasting levelling up will not just relocate a department and thousands of FTEs and say, great job done. It'll be embedded into that local economy, drive local industrial strategies and speak directly to the missions of combined authorities to ensure that these communities get a great quality of life for everyone to work, live and play. So I think this requires a cross-sector approach to getting it right, an affordable quality housing provision to support a multi-generational workforce that will equally want a home office coming back into a post-COVID environment, better than adequate transport that connects regional hubs and towns to across the country, across the UK, digital connectivity and interoperability so we can connect wherever and whenever we want, proactive healthcare and well-being messages being driven in local communities to support positive physical and mental well-being, and an exciting and varied retail, leisure and nighttime offer that's safe and secure post-COVID. So not a short list, but what's the private sector role in making that happen? Well, I think developing public-private partnerships that are mutually beneficial can become an anchor to this cross-sector collaboration success, which would equally be enhanced if there's targeted particular specialisms or sectors to focus on, which will engender confidence and investment from the private sector. And take a recent example I was made aware of around Edinburgh. Edinburgh, a city 20 years ago that was trying to decide what it wanted to be. It opted for IT when there were few IT services actually located there at the time, and targeted private sector and funding to support this. Now there are hundreds of IT firms, universities putting on IT courses, and that creates this virtuous circle of success. So where there is focus, there tends to be success, and any relocation is going to be more successful where there's an existing anchor industry, ensuring that supply chain can be easily established. There's thriving private sector, and there's a talent pool to draw on, which leads me to my final point. It's all about people and creating the best possible environment for people to bring their best selves to work. And at the launch of the Centre for Cities report yesterday, Levelling Up the UK's Regional Economies, Lord Sainsbury introduced the report by saying, growing the number of high-wage, high-value-add jobs is key to the sustainable levelling up agenda and must be supported by incentivising collaboration between colleges and universities. And I've touched on the university point already, and bringing up talent in a particular location from that education base. But in addition, talent and skills are our most valuable asset across both the public and private sector. Therefore, we should be looking to evolve our operating model structure to support that capability development and sharing of resource. So for an example, looking at co-sourcing business relationship models where functions are delivered through combined efforts of public and private sector bodies working towards a mutually beneficial goal should enable that sharing of resources and collaboration to unlock the potential to support these high value, high wage roles in these particular locations, whilst also sharing in some of that recruitment, attraction and retention risk, which can equally be one of the downsides that we've referred to earlier. So to summarise for a number of points there, I'm sure there's many more, but for sustained levelling up to be a success, I think the private sector should be challenged to support this objective, to unlock space that delivers multiple outcomes for a region, creating partnerships that support targeted sectors to stimulate investment, and finally the evolving operating models to create better access to talent and to resources. That's it from me, Matt.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. And we've got some good questions coming in. We will come back to them in a few minutes, but keep them coming. And meanwhile, if we could hear from Angela in Leeds.
Thanks, Matt, and hello and good afternoon, everybody. I am well, my colleagues call me a recovering consultant. I spent a long time as a commercial practice surveyor dealing with property and strategic development and supporting businesses with their real estate needs. And I, for my sins, decided to become client about 4 years ago. And I'm going to try and share some of my 4 years of worth of experience of being in local government, taking strategy into implementation and supporting both the private sector and public sector. And the one thing I've really learned over the last 4 years is the precision of language and really simple language. And I would kind of put forward that I don't think we have a real estate issue here. I think what we have is a real strong leadership challenge, and it's the leadership of people. And our people have spoken, and they've spoken really rapidly and quite loudly over the last 12 months. And if we'd have only got together all last year and realised we were probably all doing the same survey of our colleagues and our staff and of our cities at the same time. Because I know as a local authority that employs 14,000 people, we did that very same thing that asked, what do you want to do when we can return to the workplace and what does it look like? And the overwhelming response what we got is we want flexibility, we want choice. And when we come back into a workplace setting, it's because we want to interact with people. And actually, that's no different whether we are moving back in to our offices as a local authority in Leeds, whether you're British Telecom doing that, whether you're the FT, whether you're a government department, etc. And building on some of the language and the points that have been raised, I've probably got 3 simple things that are about making a success of government relocations. First of all, it's about really understanding the output and the outcome you want to achieve. So if you want value for money from reducing your property cost base, you will get that. But that is nowhere near as the opportunity cost you will get from increasing productivity, understanding local labour markets, and actually increasing the diversity of pathways into what are incredible professions. And I really like Philip's point about it's not just the pathway into your profession neither, into the pathways of multiple layers of government. Because if you understand how local government works and then you go into the civil service, my goodness, you are in the absolute sweet spot of driving change, let alone then if you can layer that in with how the private sector works. And we have to think about that transition, not just within government and public sector roles, but public and private. So first of all, be really clear on your outcome you're trying to make. And there is massive opportunity in relocating to places like Wolverhampton and Darlington, but be clear about the change you're trying to make. Certainly, if I think about Leeds and the announcement today, that is a phenomenal success for Leeds, and we welcome it with both arms. And we have an exceptionally strong financial sector market already in Leeds, which we can wrap around not just that labour pool that already exists, but the 70,000 students that we produce from our universities. And PwC had already kind of cottoned on to the financial strengths of the city in how they've reapproached their recruitment by putting their centre of excellence in for audit advisory and their pathway into the business into Bradford, but actually working with the University of Leeds on an apprenticeship programme. And at the end of that 4 years at PwC, you don't even have to stay or pay it back. So what a brilliant way of using some of the toolkit that we've been given. So be really clear on those outcomes. And if it's financial, that's fine. And don't be ashamed of that. But actually there's a bigger changing in those, what we used to call softer, but perhaps a more positive outcomes of cultural change. You know, that incidental learning you will get from being in a geography, that chance encounter that you will get by crossing over with other departments, but be really clear on that. And the size of the prize on that is huge. And I think that Centre for Cities report that Jenny mentioned is really powerful. And I know that Roger Marsh, who is the chair of the MP11, unfortunately sits about 4 miles away from me geographically, reminds me daily that if you can shift that productivity or equal that productivity of the Southeast outside of the Southeast, that's worth £1 billion a year. And that's just money straight in without us having to save anything. I've mentioned the second point was about that career pathways. So don't just think about inside, think about outside career pathways too. The third point I would make is if you are making relocations, really where you can get the maximum value, and certainly what I've seen from working on inward investment propositions from Burberry to Channel 4, I worked with Deloitte out in Belfast, is make sure you've got a really strong local operational board. So the board structure that Leeds, and not just Leeds, the Chief Executive of Bradford is also part of it. The board structure we put around supporting Channel 4's move into Leeds, but so that the impact could be rippled through the city region, was a massive investment of time from both the Chief Executive of Leeds, the Chief Executive of Bradford, and some very senior colleagues at Rycroft. And we've managed to deliver some real reach to actually hit their diversity outcomes that they wanted to change and really reach into the communities to get those career pathways. And another good example of that is we're very fortunate in Leeds to have, for lots of reasons, because we're very fortunate to have 4 of the HQs for the NHS, and yet still having that quantum of development or that those jobs in Leeds, the NHS still finds it very hard to recruit into local roles. And only this week we've supported them through our very local employment and skills engagement team to recruit into 100 roles to support the vaccine deployment. Now, these are fantastic roles because it means that these are usually entry-level jobs where people are getting onto an NHS contract, and the security that brings, the pension contributions, but the gateway into other job prospects is massive. So please don't see this as a real estate outcome. Please see this as about creating choice for lots of people, where if you are tucked within the 2025, people just don't have that reach. And then the final thing has to be about that quality of life. I'm a great believer in that COVID has changed nothing and accelerated everything. I have worked off this headset probably for the last 10 years, whether it be in the private sector or here. That technology has come on leaps and bounds so that we don't have to confuse proximity with visibility. So the technology is there. This really is now. Are we willing to manage by output? Are we willing to lose that connection to presenteeism? And are we really wanting to level up? And I love Jenny's point about the space between, I'm a big fan of Yangel, and the spaces between buildings are everything. The spaces between our regional cities and our mega city, which is London, because this isn't a regional versus London. London is a mega city. When Leeds did work with the MIT REAP programme, and we worked globally with 5 other cities, our colleagues in Kentucky were like, wow, you are 200 miles away from Leeds. We have 200 miles away are some of our towns that we manage. That is a huge anchor for you, and it is for all the other regional cities. So this isn't a London v regional network. This is about those spaces between regional cities that can also gain from that, and that is the Wolverhamptons, and that is the Darlingtons. And I am absolutely delighted to get to support some of that leveling up. But what we now need to do is make sure that infrastructure which connects our towns to our cities really works, because I don't know if anybody's tried to get from Leeds to Darlington, but it's not very straightforward, and it's certainly not carbon neutral. And we've got a really good rail plan that needs investment.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Angela. That's a fantastic set of contributions, I have to say. I'm going to take the opportunity to put some questions of my own before we go to the audience, but there are some great audience questions coming in, which we'll come to shortly. I mean, people have talked around aspects of this point, but it's what I do want to address sort of head on. You know, there's a political pressure really to locate civil servants in small towns. People arguing that putting in major conurbations won't kind of help reshape policy making around the needs of those more left behind communities, which is something we certainly hear from Tory MPs. Darlington has a population of 100,000. It's kind of 15 miles from Teesside. It's 40 miles from Newcastle. It's a difficult place to recruit 750 highly skilled technical professionals. Civil service bodies need access to large labour pools to recruit, and they want to base themselves in places that people want to relocate to. So there is a tension there. I mean, are there other ways to around that tension? There are ways to help address that tension. And I would ask if Stephen has a comment.
I'm not sure that's a great question to ask me. I mean, I would say that we're going to have some large, as we do now, some larger offices in big cities, and in the smaller towns there'll be smaller offices, and we should think about this as a network of offices where people can work together. It's not a choice of big cities or smaller towns. Right balance across the UK. And I think the experience of the pandemic, as Angela was saying earlier on, has proven to people that you don't physically have to be there all of the time to make your presence felt. So I'm not sure we should encourage a black and white choice. We should think about more what's the right balance and what's the right network.
Fair enough. I wonder if Philip can help me paint in some of those shades of grey then.
Yeah, inevitably there is compromise involved. You can see that very self-evident in the Darlington decision, indeed in the Wolverhampton decision, against what may be your optimal location policy in terms of drawing people in. We are going into a hybrid world, I think, and we need to get our heads around this, that all the other businesses I'm associated with accepting there's going to be more folk working from home, but they want people in the office as well, because in the office you get the social interaction, you get the networking, you get better learning. My younger, in September last year, he's not been into an office yet, though he's been working for coming up 6 months. He's getting a very different experience. Now, he's fine, he's working, he's getting on with it, but he's not getting that rich experience of interacting with his colleagues and that sort of serendipity, bumping into people and so on, which we know is so important in a work environment. So we are into a hybrid world more, and I think it is important that thinking about the location of offices, that you're in a context where people want to be sort of critical mass of roles. So there is a career structure there, and that sort of reinforces the whole location policy, if you like. Inevitably, the politics comes into this. I think my personal preference would be to choose maybe 3 or 4 major locations in England outside of London, and build and very determinedly build up those locations with make sure you've got a decent career structure. But politics that says that you try and give everybody a little slice of the pie. That's the tension, and ultimately it's the politicians who have to resolve that.
Okay, thanks. Jenny, do you have any thoughts around how to sort of navigate around that tension or find a solution to this?
I mean, I'd just build on the points actually Stephen's alluded to it, and actually Angela as well, in terms of outcomes. I suppose if you take Darlington as an example, a relatively small town, but actually surrounding Darlington is a great connection of Russell Group universities, not necessarily great transport links across, you know, on that access, but down to London and to other areas, there's some good transport links and cheap rents, availability of space and opportunities to look at repurposing. The challenge, I suppose, from that outcome perspective is around that thriving private sector. You know, is that there to really catalyst and generate the type of momentum relocate to the area. But I think seeing, as Stephen mentioned, this as a network rather than isolated towns and places, you know, through COVID, yes, we have all been at home over the last 12 months, not able to move. Once the shackles are released, people will want to be getting back out there, and our transport links will become inevitably more important than ever to enable these networks, hub and spoke type networks to exist. So I think that's my, you know, the sort of smaller towns in isolation, but recognizing it that it's got other outcomes to deliver.
Thank you. Angela, you did make some comments around this. Anything to add? Or,
I think it's a massive opportunity as long as you are clear on the right outcome you are trying to achieve. And I totally agree that this is about connectivity into a labour market. For instance, the east of, certainly the population that HS2 East would serve is 15 million people. And at the minute, those connections for Darlington to really thrive and to really access is certainly lacking in investment, to put it politely. And we can't have one level of investment which isn't backed up with all the other real ingredients that make it work. So I suppose that is one part of the jigsaw. What are the others that now need to follow if you really want to make it successful?
Thank you. There's one question here from Brittany Benson Cooper. It would be great to get your insights as to why you think Darlington was chosen as the location for the economic campus. Obviously, none of you are. If any of you have any thoughts, Brittany Benson Cooper would be curious to hear them.
What you see reported, and I have no inside knowledge on this whatsoever, but from what you see reported, that there were official recommendations and there was a political decision. So this is a very good example of that balance between the politics of location policy and the optimal location policy, if I could put it like that. Darlington is great. It is well connected. So I mean, I go through Darlington at least twice a week. In normal times, if I'm going down to London, it is on the East Coast Main Line. Is well connected. It is within reach of those great universities of Durham, Newcastle, and so on. In some respects, if you wanted to go for the maximum local economic benefit, you wouldn't have put it in Darlington. You'd put it in Middlesbrough. Because Darlington itself is a reasonably prosperous town, as I understand it. So that balance of considerations, great for Darlington that got those jobs. But I think what the Treasury is going to have to think really hard about is not how you get people recruited into Darlington, but how you build career structures there. And it'll be a little bit harder for them because you're not rubbing shoulders with the folk that you would have done if you put it in Newcastle, for example, in HMRC or DWP, or indeed that wider public-private sector. So that's the compromise they've made. Fair enough. But as both Andrew and Jenny said, this is about thinking about the outcomes you want and not dodging that, and being clear about the outcomes you're pursuing, and make therefore the thing a logical program rather than just happen chance of who shouts loudest last.
Thank you very much, Philip. This question around policy making. I mean, the theory that if you are if you're living outside of London, then you'll be more plugged into people's feelings and need to look at civil servants' surprise at the Brexit vote, for example, to realise that actually, there's a cultural thing going on there. They can be quite isolated. How powerful do you think it is, people's physical location, in helping them to shape policy? Could I ask Stephen, there's a better question for Stephen?
Yeah, so it's got to be important, hasn't it? I mean, if you're only looking at a problem from you're working with a group of people who largely live, work, and experience the same environment as you do, you despite where you originally travel from, you will build up a specific worldview, and we need to make sure that the worldview in the management of the UK is a pan-UK one. And so it's really important to have people in the major cities of the UK, not just London, but Leeds and Manchester and Birmingham, but also Glasgow and Edinburgh and smaller, a balance. But I do accept the need to keep people connected. Technology can do a huge amount for that, but there's also a social cohesion point in making sure that there's an opportunity for people to collaborate with people from other departments and the broader public sector. And clearly that's easier in places where there are larger numbers, and that speaks more to the larger cities. And that's one of the reasons why we're taking an approach that says, here's a network of offices. We'll have offices in larger places. In the bigger cities, we'll be providing conference facilities and business event centres to allow people to come together from time to time from across that region and work effectively together across departments and with wider public sector too, like the local authorities and other bodies in the area.
Thank you. Just going to ask Andrew if it's something that you've seen, because you've got a big cluster of civil service bodies there. Have you seen their attitudes to what the country needs and how to take it forward?
I think there are lots of parts to that question, Matt. I think so. Leeds has been home to the NHS. I mean, it's interesting. The NHS has two headquarters. One of them is Quarry House in Leeds. The other one's Skipton House, which isn't in Skipton. Quarry House has been around since, gosh, the early 90s now. I think that was the original Lions Review. And in terms of not just the infrastructure bank, but the government hub that's coming here. And yet, we still get maps that don't show Leeds in the right geography. And that's not just Leeds. We had one with Middlesbrough the other week, etc. And, I've got a geography degree, but I didn't think, tectonic plates had moved that quickly. So a long-winded answer to saying it helps, but we're not there yet. And I think one of your colleagues, one of the participants on the Q&A made a really good point about when they were located at Quarry House. They were very connected to the organisation, and that's the critical point. And that's the point I raised about making sure that when you are relocating, you get an operational board with the local authority and local business partners that can really help network you into the local culture and the local business culture. And that's what we've seen work really, really well. We've seen it work well with Burberry. We've seen it work well with iWalker, which are a fintech bank. We've seen it work well with Reed Smith, and we've seen it play dividends with Channel 4.
Thank you. Actually, let's answer. It says it's good that public sector workers don't have to move to London to progress. We've done this before, though. I worked at Quarry House at the turn of the millennium, and there did not seem to be much engagement with the local community. Most people in the area probably didn't even know what went on in the Kremlin, as it was called. How can we try to add life rather than suck the life from the immediate surroundings as jobs move out from London? That's Jenny.
Throwing that one my way. So
Yes.
I feel about this maximising local perspective and trying to, see this as a opportunity that's multifaceted. And one of the areas I think that's really interesting to explore is that it's creating that centre of excellence and really bringing all sectors, private sector, third sector, and indeed the public sector as that anchor on that journey. And I think, there's an element of what my colleagues have said on the panel in terms of the collaboration between those public sector broadly. And Angela, I was really interested to hear about the PwC example, in Bradford, and that really being a catalyst to support the financial grassroots perspective into those careers, I suppose what we're looking at here is that other lens and thinking back into the community, and that has to be across multiple sectors. And I suppose I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective, but really keen to ensure that we leverage those opportunities when they're forthcoming, so people wholeheartedly feel like they're there to support those communities to thrive. And it's not just about work, it is about living and playing as well. You know, we've got to have it as a whole total package.
Philip, have you got any thoughts on Jeremy King's question there?
I do have quite strong thoughts on it. I say, you know, this is driven by my own personal experience of working on devolution policy, constitutional stuff in the Cabinet Office from 2012, actually all the way through till when I finished in the civil service. And it, you know, because I said I was based in Scotland. I just to give the Brexit referendum, but I was leading for the UK civil service on the Scottish referendum. You know, when I got on my bike on a Sunday morning, I could, you know, bootle off around the towns of East Lothian and see the number of yes stickers in the windows. I had a feel, actually a visual feel for what was going on in the campaign. I wouldn't have got that if I'd been living in London, even though I had quite a lot of experience of working in Scotland previously. I think there is a risk here of some of these locations, if what we see post-COVID is a sort of a reverse commute pattern, where people stay based in, for the sake of argument, in the home counties and commute up to the office in Darlington or Leeds or Wolverhampton, or where it may be, on, you know, a couple of times a week. It's really important, as both Jenny and Angela have said, that people locate in these areas. They move there, they live there, the kids go to school there, their partners get, you know, work there as well, in order to get the full benefit. But I think it will make for a far richer civil service experience. I'd like to see a day when, you know, you go up to, you know, the top level of the civil service, when folk around that permanent secretary table, at least half of them live outside of London or the home counties. They live somewhere else in the country. I think you'd get a far richer debate about a lot of the really critical issues, policy issues that face the country than you get at the moment. As I said, marked by my own experience of this, worrying about the integrity of the United Kingdom for so long, I think this is really important stuff.
Okay, thank you. Angela, did you want to add something?
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. And only because it's a real good example is the Quarry Hill one, which the participant raises, because actually one of the issues there is physical barriers. You know, whilst it's located in the city centre, it's next to what is the inner ring road, which is about 7 sheer metres of steel, and next to one of our most deprived communities of Lincoln Green. So even if you could see Quarry House, and you can because it's substantial, you can't get to it. So if people physically can't see a way into a building, and this is a very commercial practice surveyor conversation, is they can't mentally see a way in neither. And that's where place will really play its role. And it's interesting that we did some work with these teaching hospitals in the country, and also have a headquarters just the other side of that physical barrier. And we did, again, with our employment and skills team, we reached into that community for jobs that were hard to recruit into, because people lived nearby and they could get into these roles physically, but they couldn't get them into them through paperwork. And when we did that, we found doctors, clinical staff, nurses, as well as people who were coming through on their entry program. So that community locality is critical if you can get it right. And to come back to the Bradford example with PwC, PwC did that as a real entrance, and what they found was there were people applying with MBAs to work with PwC in Bradford because they wanted to be in Bradford. So please don't underestimate the power of what it might not be the city. It's lots of others. And I think there was a question about diversity, and if you're going to come to it, I won't say very much, but actually, you know, places like Bradford, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham are more diverse than London, would you dare imagine? And actually are some of our youngest population as well. And now more than ever, they need that help into these career pathways.
Thank you, Angela. Stephen, were you waiting to come back in on this one?
Well, I think it's been a really good conversation there, and we've talked quite a lot on this location, why choose this city over that location. But I think micro location is also really important, and um, perhaps there have been some not great choices in the past. We need to make sure that when we choose the locations of any new buildings that we might want to invest in, we choose them in the context of how they're going to sit within the city, within the town. And so that's something we need to work with local authorities on. We're very keen that the walls of the building are not necessarily a boundary, that they're porous, and that the local community can come in to an extent. And clearly there are some parts of the building that are secure, but that doesn't apply everywhere. And also that the people who work in those buildings can go out. And I strongly agree with the point about living and working in the area, not living there, not having a family there, not having a background there, not having an experience in the local area negates a large part of the point.
Thank you. Whilst you're there, can I ask you to address Elaine Donald's question as well? Do you see the layout of the early hubs changing to have more collaborative spaces? How do you move people away from the desk-based culture?
So I don't know whether Elaine's got an inside line there, because she might know that I was involved with the design of the early hubs. So we're sticking with our workplace design guide that we devised all those years ago. But we have clearly learned as we've gone along and improved it as we've moved. The solution that we chose was always a modular one, with the idea that you could swap out banks of desks with an area for project space, with area for collaboration, with breakout space. And in the game of trying to encourage the maximum amount of collaboration space. Before COVID, we often struggled with persuading departments that was a good idea. And very often people were looking for banks of desks despite our best advice. We're now finding that conversation has changed completely, and we're having a much better discussion about how best to support productivity, what are the best arrangements for people. And as I was saying in my introduction, a recognition that offices exist for rework, they exist to support community, to support caring, to support collaboration, to support connection and cohesion, things that are difficult to do elsewhere. The other thing I would say to Elaine is that we've made some significant improvements in that design guide, particularly in areas like inclusivity. So making sure that we're addressing not just physical, visible impairments, but also invisible impairments, so that the spaces are suitable for everyone. Continue to learn with each building we do, and hopefully we're learning and getting better.
Great, thank you. We will come back to this topic in 1 second, but actually just quickly, can I ask you Malcolm Boswell's question? He's asking how engaged the civil service unions with the relocations agenda. Have they got a perspective on it, Stephen?
Oh, sorry. For me, yeah. The civil service unions are engaged, and Places for Growth meet with them regularly on this particular issue. And in GPA's case, also, there's lots of things that we are keen to engage with our union colleagues on, not just how the spaces work, but also they're very interested too in the supply chain that supports these, about the whole picture. So it's not just about how civil servant colleagues are supported, but also how all of the people who are working in the buildings are looked after. And that's something we work with them quite closely on.
Thank you. Yes, so just that question actually around how you create a space for people considering moving to a location. Actually, what's the kind of nature of the workspace they need? Angela.
I think this is a really interesting and dynamic point. I do take Stephen's point about we have to now create flexible workspaces. Certainly what I found doing work, not just with our organisation, but with the business broadly, with people like KPMG and Atkins and DLA, etc., is that it actually is, there are some broad principles that certainly people want to come back in for more social activity. but some people will need to be desk-based if they don't have that safe environment at home. But it is about creating a much more collaborative environment, so not banks and banks of desks, much more softer furnishing, fitting, and it's not just about conference centres neither, it's about that intermediary between there's 50% of people attending this meeting in the office, but there's actually 50% of people driving those people online in the office, so they have the same quality of or the parity of that meeting experience. And this, again, whilst there are some what we call bites, bricks and behavior elements, so the bricks will be part of it, you know, the bites, the technology is another, but the other element is behaviors and how you learn to chair meetings which are virtual, how you lead to be more inclusive, how actually you can't just have one chair if you're hybrid, you need somebody who's actually helping and assisting you, and the spaces will have to remain flexible. The challenge we have, which I found is quite nuanced in local authority, is if I speak to people who say, we've got our office layout return nailed, it's brilliant, it's this, and I go, that's brilliant, you are a firm of architects and you do architecture, you are a firm of solicitors and you practice law. We're a practice of the local authority, and I have safeguarding issues, I have social can't remember the names of them, social practitioners, I have safeguarding officers, I have democratic processes. Last week we had to do panel virtually, and we were debating a very contentious expansion to the airport. We had 10 hours of political and democratic processes in action virtually, and I think it will be very, very different for every organisation, but it will all play around that shift between, it will be on the balance of more collaborative working than it will in social, less social activities which are desk-based.
Thank you. Jenny, do you have any, what are the workspaces good?
I mean, just to build, I mean, Angela's points are very well made. So just to build on those points, we've actually, Montague Evans have recently done a relocation across London. So not levelling up in that degree, but we've moved office space in totality and into a much more modern, collaborative work environment. And actually, you know, there's a couple of us who haven't had the pleasure of going there yet because of the lockdown restrictions, but it is exactly as Angela said, really collaborative, a lot of soft furnishings, a lot of ability to collaborate, not at a desk, but supported heavily by digital means so that you can connect from various different locations and work with partners across the UK or indeed wider. But the one bit I think that's really important is that we support our younger talent coming up in their learning and development needs. And that was clearly called out when a need that they wanted to come back into the office. So you mentioned, Angela, about the training on chairing. I think training on managing teams virtually and supporting people in their career development with either professional accreditations or just career development in general tends to have better outcomes when that's enabled face to face. So we need that different level of interaction, and I think those spaces we've all described and we're all probably going to go back into do enable that to happen.
Thank you. So no, they do sound very attractive. Workspace cabin in Streatham, amazingly, but how do we make sure that civil service organisations retain those remodeled ways of working that we picked up in the pandemic, embed them, and move to a point where actually physical location isn't as important in influence and in connections? Stephen, can I ask you that one? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just trying to read the questions, and I missed what you were saying there, Matt. Will you run
just how we make sure that the civil service retains the new ways of working that's been adopted during the pandemic.
That is a really good point, and we could easily go backwards if we're not careful. So a lot of lessons being learned, and there's work in hand right now to make sure we embed those things for the future. So as we return to the office, for those people who haven't been working there throughout over the next few months, we want to make sure that we do that in a safe way, because we do expect that there'll be a degree of COVID restrictions around for some time, but we do need to make sure that we can make a step towards hybrid working and embed those behaviors that people have learned and not allow things to go backwards. And I think it was Angela talking about the way of chairing meetings and what's important and what's not. Even simple things like, if you're in a room, can you just interrupt and speak as you used to do in a meeting, or do you have to go through the process of putting your hand up and waiting for the chair to come to you, so that everybody is managed in an inclusive way? I think those sort of things are really important, and we're thinking right now about what are the right HR policies to support hybrid working? What's the right technology to support hybrid working? How do we carry those things forward? Because there's such a great opportunity, and we wish we hadn't had the opportunity, but now that we have had it, tragically, we need to seize it.
Yeah, thank you. And can I sort of same question to Philip, really, because you can see the pressures. You know, ministers are going to want to be in Westminster, of course, and you know, a lot of them like to deal face to face. There is things that could pull people back.
Yeah. Undoubtedly, and I think being alive to those pressures is important. I think what Stephen says absolutely right. You've got to establish the protocols. What are the expectations? What are the behaviours that are required? Just as a sort of tangent to that, we're going into a hybrid world. We've got to work out what we do with hybrid meetings, which is I think this is really difficult when you've got half the folk zooming in and half in the room. This requires really tight protocols. I think some businesses that I'm aware of, even they'll have people zooming in from the same building, so they'll make it all zoom in, are all physically present. You know, different choices to be made around all of that. But it just needs real clarity of thought, but it particularly requires leadership, actually, from the top of the civil service. So, you know, this is the way we're going to work, because it's that leadership which will be proof against the bad-tempered ministers. And I don't care where X, Y, or Z are, I want them in the room right now. And that's the sort of proper relocation, where you're actually developing the jobs and the people and the infrastructure away from Whitehall. So ministers have got a really important role to play in this. The civil service can help themselves by having, I say, those very visible protocols, binding ministers into those protocols. But it does require the leadership of the civil service to believe in this and to adopt the practice themselves. I have to say, in my day, I didn't see a lot of it, and it used to drive me nuts. So hopefully there's been a bit of a change, but it's going to be quite hard work. And I think, you know, Global Government Forum and others need to just keep the civil service honest on this. So haul them back in a couple of years' time. Actually, has it worked out like it was, you know, have they done what they said they would do?
Yeah. Well, we've come back to it after 9 months, and we will keep coming back to it, because I do find this topic really interesting. And I mean, just there's this other, this wider topic, which it is worth, I think, briefly asking the last few minutes. So the government's trying to ensure that its sort of national, public services and policies meet the needs of communities across the country by basing national officials there, who then feed back into national policy making. You could instead devolve areas of policy and service delivery to the city, regional or local level, and let communities choose their own way forward. Can the relocations policy take the edges off the kind of highly centralised structures we have, or is genuine devolution required really to achieve the goals they're aiming for? And I will go to Angela, if I may.
It's a really simple question, thanks, Matt. I think there's a role for both. And not sitting on the fence. And I think you can look to things like test and trace for an example of where actually local intervention much earlier would have been so much more proactive. And that didn't happen for lots of reasons, but local authorities and local areas understand their communities, and their communities are very complex. So they will always know their local needs. And there is a place for national policy and unity to make sure all those places certainly sing off the same hymn sheet if they don't use the same instruments. So I think there really is a role for both, and certainly in West Yorkshire, we're really looking forward to obviously our mayoral election, which will happen very shortly. And we've spoke for a long time about what that will bring, and I'm really looking forward to not just talking about what it will bring, but really seeing what that will bring. And I think the next piece of policy to come out of government will be the integrated rail plan, which will perhaps show whether or not we really are going to get local decision making on where infrastructure is needed, or it's going to be a centralised approach.
Yes, fair enough. I shouldn't really place them in counterpoint, but I'll broaden the question a bit, perhaps for Jenny, and ask, from what you've seen, what are the kind of local powers and responsibilities that can help, a city or town thrive, supporting the wider levelling up agenda?
I suppose it comes back to what I mentioned in my introductory comments earlier on about ensuring, so if levelling up is to be successful, well, sustainable and long lasting, embedding with that local economy in hopefully supporting and driving those industrial strategies and plans that are already well in place and being delivered, and speaking to those mission statements of the combined authorities, and recognising that the devolved powers that need to go with that to make a success have to respond to some of those things. I mean, I've done work with combined authorities before, and it really is down to being able to make those robust decisions at a local level where the successes and the benefits are found. So, I mean, I don't want to sit on the fence either, but if you are looking for that, what is making levelling up a success, I think that embedding in the local economy is absolutely instrumental, and supporting those mission statements of those combined authorities.
Thank you. And I'd ask Philip if you think wider devolution could support levelling up more widely.
Yes, I won't sit on the fence. Of course it should. It should, and it can, and it should. England remains the most centralised polity, certainly in Europe, probably in the wider democratic world. It is absolutely bonkers that a department in London is running schools throughout England pretty much, and actually that process of nationalisation, which is effectively what it is, carries on. And you've seen that, the recent stuff on planning, which they rode back from, but there was a pitch there essentially to further restrict local decision making by councils. It's virtually a nationalisation of planning. I think it's not good for democracy. It's not good for development. Ultimately, the powers in England do need to be devolved further down over education, I'd argue healthcare as well, economic development, in order to give local people the choices and engagement in their futures. We've tried every other variant over the years. We've had regional strategies for decades now, and they've not actually succeeded in doing what they set out to succeed. So let's try in a bit of local democracy to it as well, and have proper devolution in England. It's a great cause. It'll take a while to come, but we'll get there eventually.
Thank you, Philip. And at the risk of running 1 minute over, I'm going to put a different question to Stephen. You've been working for a long time trying to give civil servants the tools for remote working, for smarter working, to build the new hubs, to sort of move the way that civil servants treat offices and property. And I mean, we do seem to be seeing a huge amount of change. The pandemic obviously has been an awful thing in many ways. It is one of the silver linings that actually that it really creates the groundwork, the foundations for the kind of change that you've been trying to push forward for a long time.
Yes, no, I think that's definitely the case. I don't want to have a conversation with departments about cleanliness of toilets or repairs in buildings. I'd much rather have a conversation about how you can support the productivity of our people, how you can support the well-being of our people. And I think the focus that the pandemic has brought to the world of work has allowed us to think more clearly about those things. And I do see the conversation changing, and I hope that continues, and I'll certainly continue to press for it to change. So of course we will still need to think about how well we maintain and support our buildings. Of course we'll continue to think about what's the relative cost of our buildings, but we shouldn't be thinking about that as an overhead. We should be thinking about how we support our people, and that's investing in better productivity. And so the marginal benefit of that, taken together with working effectively in a local environment so they really understand what's going on across the country, that's something worth chasing.
Thank you so much. And yes, we are out of time now. Thank you very much indeed to Stephen Boyd, Philip Rycroft, Jenny Ryden and Angela Barnacle. Thank you to the audience for viewing us. You'll have received a feedback survey. If you fill it in and ping it back to us, we'll hopefully do these things better in future. And we'll shortly send everybody also a link to the full session and our write-up in a couple of weeks' time. Meanwhile, everybody have a lovely afternoon. I will see you up north as soon as I'm allowed. Thank you.